The program will begin shortly. The program will begin shortly. To start the morning, please welcome Michelle Berger from the city of Miami Beach.
Good morning, everyone. My name is Michelle Berger, and I'm the co-producer of the Aspen Ideas Climate event. My day job is serving as Chief of Staff to Miami Beach Mayor Dan Gelber, and over the last 13 months, my other day job has been consumed with trying to put together the necessary elements to make this event the success that I think it is becoming. Producing the Aspen Ideas Climate event with the best professional team ever, led by CEO Dan Porterfield, has really been a dream, and it's been a true labor of love. And we're very, very excited that we will be announcing the second year event in March of 2023 shortly. A little over a year ago, Mayor Gelber and I started conversations with two local residents, Howard Draft and Jordy Levy. And before we knew it, we were speaking with the CEO, Dan Porterfield, who suggested we partner to create this event. So here we are today. And where are we today? Well, we have over 1,710 attendees, 220 speakers, speaking at 51 sessions, attendees from half a dozen countries. We've had 3 governors, we've had 3 college presidents, we've had a half a dozen deans from different universities, we've had over a dozen mayors and other elected officials, we've had 15 artists, and Emilio Estefan wrote a theme song for us, which we're introducing tomorrow at the Miami Beach Convention Center. We've also hosted over 24. Emilio will be here too, and so he's excited to talk about why he decided to write a song for us. Over 24 ancillary activities also have taken place over the last few days and will happen over the next 2 days, including free films at Florida International University, the Bandshell in North Beach. We've had hundreds of local residents attending events for free. We have a snorkel cleanup today. We've had a visit to the Stiltsville homes in Biscayne Bay. We've had about a half a dozen resiliency tours. We've had visits to the University of Miami Sustain wind wave tank. We've had a tour of the microgrid at Florida University's College of Engineering, as well as a tour of the Underline. We've had 98 young people, I'm calling them young, I'm now telling you how old I am, between the ages of 18 and 30, who were hand-selected to create our inaugural cohort Future Leaders program, one of my favorite programs this year. The goal of this program is to inspire future leaders to develop solutions and introduce new strategies for action related to climate. While the production of this event has been a personal labor of love, I have not done this at all alone. We have had dozens of volunteers, and I want to give a personal shout out to my team. Many of them I can't name personally, but I have had the pleasure of working with 2 powerhouse Veronicas and a Daniela. And the police and the fire department, everyone has done a great job keeping us safe. And with the trust of over 24 partners, we made Aspen Ideas Climate happen, and I personally want to thank my dear friends at Aspen who have helped create such a terrific content program to make this successful. We've engaged local residents like Stuart Miller from Lennar, the Knight Foundation, George, JP, Nick Perez from Related, Amazon, Antonio Gracias from Valor, Orlando Bravo from Tama Bravo, Amy and Jack Glotman, Diana Ollis, Alex Kleiner, Alex and Steve Witkoff, and so many others. So we've made it to day 3, and I hope each of you have heard inspiring talks, had great conversations, and I hope you've been left with some very thought-provoking ideas of how to implement some solutions. So I hope you have a terrific morning, and I want to talk to you a minute about our lineup. And just for the record, I booked Commissioner Adams many, many months ago. It's totally coincidental that he happens to be here for the Miami Heat game. It was a very big win last night, hence this. But I am proud of the commissioner's commitment to this subject matter, and I'm so happy that we were able to engage him to speak to you this morning. NBA Commissioner Adam Silver is going to talk about what his league is doing about climate change this morning. Ocean expert Daniela Fernandez is going to share how she's empowering innovators of tomorrow. Indigenous youth leader Owen Oliver is going to tell us how to unleash the power of indigenous knowledge. We will learn about how biotech engineer Marissa Cuevas Flores is making fish farming more sustainable. The Aspen Institute's Tech Policy Hub is going to make an exciting announcement. And finally, for a conversation that I know is on a lot of people's minds, foreign policy experts Jason Bordoff and Meghan O'Sullivan are going to discuss how the Ukraine is impacting our energy landscape. So have a great day, and let's get started. Thank you.
And now, Adam Silver with Tom Farrey from the Aspen Institute Sports and Society program.
Wow. Well, before we get started here, a quick personal note of thanks to Mayor Gelber and everyone who made this incredible event possible. It's special to me. My father grew up just 3 or 4 blocks from here, and his father created Farrey Hardware and Lighting, which has dressed up many of the hotels and homes in this area. And his father was John J. Farrey, who was the chief building inspector in the 1920s. And when the hurricane came through and just wiped out almost everything, was asked to put in place the strongest building codes in the country. And that is what has underpinned these Art Deco buildings and why they've survived 100 years. And the reason I mention this is because, I think a lot about that legacy in our work at the Aspen Institute and my particular project, which the MBA has been a part of as well. It's called Project Play, and it's about building healthy children and communities through sports. And key to that is getting very clear on what good looks like in the provision of youth sport experiences to kids. What do they deserve? What are their rights exactly? And it's almost like an act of like, how do we build a building code that is sustainable, that is resilient, as you say here in Miami, that can withstand economic ups and downs and technology turns and a pandemic. And so, again, the MBA is a partner in our work, and thank you, Adam, for being part of Project Play and everything that we're doing there.
Thank you, Tom. Yeah.
So a couple things to know about Adam. First of all, he is one of, if not the most thoughtful leaders in all of sports. I've been doing this for 50 years. He's been a great asset to this space. Under Adam, the NBA and WNBA and its players have leveraged their cultural power to press for social justice, mental health, voting access, and other causes. You know, control of the US Senate swung to the current party that is in power in no small part because of the activations of players in Georgia. So let's start there, Adam, as we make this turn toward climate. You have levers to affect change. What levers do you see the NBA having in making a difference on this very complex issue of climate change?
Well, look, thanks, Tom. And let me begin by saying how appreciative I am that you're even including me and the NBA in this conference, and it means a lot. And I'd begin there by, number one, we have a platform. We have, you know, through, as you said, not just the NBA, but the WNBA. You know, we have a G League, you know, a 2K league. We have enormous reach, particularly on a global scale, well into the billions of people who follow our leagues in one way or another. So we have this convening power that even by virtue of my being included in this conference, that's a signal that we're sending to our many fans and followers of our leagues that this is something that is a priority for us. And looking back now, a number of years in the league, roughly around 15 years ago, then Commissioner David Stern created something called NBA Green, became actualized in an NBA Green Week, where, and part of it was a visual representation for our fans of a special shooting shirt, logos, signage, et cetera, on the court. But I think even then, back 15 years ago, when it wasn't as topical as it is now, there was no doubt that people took notice and said, this is something the league cares about, it's something its players care about, there must be something of interest here that we should be paying attention to. And so I think first and foremost, it's elevating the conversation. I mean, we don't present ourselves certainly as experts, certainly not me, on this issue, but I think by partnering, whether it's with the Aspen Institute or other organizations, by the way, one of the reasons David Stern got so involved in this issue 15 years ago was his wife, Diane, and she still is, was a longtime board member of Earth Justice, an advocacy group, you know, legal advocacy group on these issues. And I think, you know, though it became part of the league's DNA from the top, from leadership saying, this is something important that we have to be paying a lot of attention to.
Mm-hmm. Was it the right thing to do, or were there, you know, what are the benefits in
well, you know, it's interesting, back when we started this 15 years ago, I would, on the spectrum in terms of good for business, right thing to do, that I would have said at that time, it wasn't something that a lot of businesses were talking about, sustainability generally. And so I think this was something where David Stern and his wife Diane were clearly leaders and brought the league along with them. I would say now that, and I personally have nothing wrong with companies doing the right thing, not necessarily saying for the wrong reason, but because it's something that their customers or their view is required of their brand. And I think we're seeing a lot more of that now, but that's okay. And I think that for advocacy groups and people who are talking about these issues, the fact that in many cases their customers are bringing them along, nothing wrong with that. And I've seen that in the apparel industry, where, for example, particularly when they're targeting a young audience, and I won't say any of the companies won't call them out, but I think that in many cases, their customers were ahead of them and were demanding, for example, in their shoes, that they be using sustainable materials. And it was something maybe wasn't top of mind for those companies, but in a positive way, they were responding to the marketplace. So, you know, and I see nothing wrong with that. I mean, and I will say in the MBA, I think it's, while there was no doubt that we started doing this because of David's leadership and because it felt like the right thing to do for the world, that now I think it also is good business. And I don't think businesses should shy away from that. And also in part be very transparent and outspoken about what they are doing, because people will pay attention to that for good reasons.
Yeah. So give me some examples of the things the NBA has done since 2008, aligned with this commitment, and where you are now, and maybe how you see it going forward.
Well, I'd begin by the program I mentioned, sort of this NBA Green program, where then we found again, we're a team in the NBA of 30 teams, WNBA 12 teams, that it helps to add some formality to it. Well, you have teams, and following, you know, David Stern's lead, enormous credit to our teams too, who took this on. But I think by having structure around our programs, for example, by something like NBA Green Week, where it's very visual. I mean, that people are looking at highlights, tuning into games, and the people then see that part of it is just, you know, the representation in terms of what the players are wearing on the floor and drawing attention to it. So sort of, I think, again, by us being this platform, first and foremost, we can bring attention to the issue. But then more substantively, I think looking at our arenas, 10 of our NBA arenas are now LEED certified. And I think any arena that's now coming online, sustainability becomes top of mind, becomes part of the discussion, the very design of the arena. Right. And that how can we move towards more sustainability in terms of these buildings. I think it manifests itself in the travel of NBA teams. We're huge consumers of carbon in that we fly our teams all over the country. We've made changes to our schedule to reduce the travel, saying if that a team is going to LA, it may seem like a simple thing, but play the Lakers and the Clippers in the same trip rather than crisscrossing across the country, right, you know, for separate times. We can do that. That can make a difference. In terms of food, it's an example here in Miami with the Miami Heat. They created a program where excess food is then distributed to food banks throughout the city of Miami, so to avoid waste there. There are things, as I mentioned earlier, that we're in partnership with Nike, doing things in terms of our uniforms, in terms of sustainability, in terms of the shoes the players are wearing. Bringing attendance, well, there's an enormous attention on the travel of our players as a percentage of travel around the league. It's minuscule compared to all the fans in 30 cities who are traveling to games. So there can be, both in terms of where we put our arenas and then focusing people on how to travel there. A great example in my hometown in New York City, where the Brooklyn Nets, where their arena is now located, a hub of public transportation, encouraging people to use public transportation to get to those games. So it's a long list of things. There are lots of different acronyms within the league and lots of different programs. But again, I think it begins more as a thematic, and then the teams find ways in their communities to express themselves on these issues.
What's interesting about this theme is it's related in some way to another theme that you've addressed, which is racial justice and building up black communities and so forth, right? I mean, where does NBA Green layer with your commitment to black and brown communities?
You know, it's a great point, Tom, because like so many issues impacting our society and our world for that matter, it has a dramatically disparate impact on those who are less fortunate. And I think in the NBA, and I have no doubt something that you all have been talking about the last few days here, that there is an enormous social justice component to sustainability and climate issues. And so for us, again, in terms of using our convening power to discuss these issues, I think first and foremost, we need to begin by agreeing on a common set of facts and talking about those issues. And there's no doubt that when you look at a very urban sport like the NBA, very obviously based in cities around the country, and I think basketball viewed as a city sport in many ways, that pointing out where, to the extent there is a disparate impact, particularly on people of color in this country, that it's again something that drawing political leaders to, drawing consumers to, and fans to, in terms of where we can use our voice. I think that becomes very important.
And not just your voice, but your players' voices, right? So how do you engage your players how do you get them educated, find a champion or two or three who then uses their social media and really brings the environmental justice conversation to those communities?
So I want to make sure I give our players the credit they deserve as leaders on these issues. I mean, even in your introduction, when you were talking about the Senate races in Georgia, I mean, credit to those WNBA players and the team in Georgia that really led the way there. And yes, in partnership with the WNBA, in partnership with the NBA, but we're equal partners here. And I think here, whether it's the National Basketball Players Association, also co-leading these efforts with us, but then individual players as members of the community. Well, the best thing about the NBA and the WNBA, with all these players, we work with them to find the issues that they're most passionate about. I mean, I think not surprisingly, it's generally not effective if somebody isn't speaking from the heart on these issues. And I think what we find with our players is that whether it's social justice or mental wellness these days, or basketball skills themselves, that we have a menu of opportunities for them to get involved in, and also working with the teams too, that they identify their players who have particular focuses of interest. And I think here that again with our players, through conversations that our folks have with them, where they're identifying things that are particular passions of theirs, they generally step up and they're saying, and it begins whether it's a public service announcement or things they're actually doing in their community or leading by example. In many cases too, our players are young folks, and often they're reaching out either to the league or to the Players Association and saying, in some cases, I'm looking at the very marketing that my team and league are doing. Take NBA Green Week, for example, and saying, I want to better understand this issue myself because I recognize, I've learned, I know enough to know there's an issue, but how can I be more helpful? So it's symbiotic in that we're constantly working with each other and identifying those players that care the most about particular issues. Yeah,
I mean, the challenge is to take a very complex topic and boiling it down to very, making it real and,
Well, I'm glad you said that, because I think even for the role that the league can play, one of the things that I'm always reminding my colleagues of is that in addition to being very transparent about what we're doing, I want to be cautious about overstating either the impact of what we're doing or the very programs that I think generally on this issue that it's very important that we all be honest with each other about what can make a difference and how soon and how impactful. And I think in our community, I don't want to sit here and say because we are using sustainable material for our uniforms necessarily that we're going to change the world, but my personal view on this issue too is that there's no single thing that's going to make the difference. It's a lot of small acts, and that by this huge following globally that the NBA has, when people are seeing, well, all right, the NBA is taking these incremental steps, the players are taking those incremental steps, what can I do differently? Recognizing that in totality, we really can hopefully have a huge impact on the world.
Yeah, Africa is the most impacted by climate change, and yet has the smallest carbon footprint. You now have NBA Africa. In 2019, the NBA, I think, was the first professional sports league in the US to sign the UN framework for climate change action. Signatories are, quote, requested to commit to achieving specific climate goals of halving emissions by 2030 and aiming to achieve net zero by 2040. We get there?
So let me just begin by saying, yes, we are one of the signatories of that UN commission. I think in order to get there in terms of the 50% reduction, where it has to begin with understanding exactly what our emissions are now. Mm-hmm. And I think that goes to my earlier point about making sure we're not over-promising and complete transparency. I mean, we're pledging to get there, so our goal is to get there. But I think in order to measure what the there is, I think that we have a lot of work to do around the league to best understand what our footprint is right now, right, and then go from there. But I think that's the perfect example too, that of convening power, bringing the NBA and the WNBA along, and then hopefully others will follow and become part of something much larger and build coalitions.
Yeah. Is there anything more that's on the table as you go forward? I'm thinking about, like, you know, partner relationships, right? I mean, the climate change is extremely complicated. Like, let's take crypto.com, right? Right now, and maybe it's going to change in a year or two or three. It's pretty tough on the environment, you know, the miners and all the energy that goes into supporting that kind of infrastructure. We got crypto.com, you know, arena now in LA, but it's not like they're just investing in the NBA. The F1 race that was here 2 days ago was the crypto.com race. So, I mean, there's a lot of money and a lot of opportunity flowing into these spaces. So, when you enter into partnerships or you consider partners, are there or could there be filters or conversations that could be had as you know, in terms of assessing or activating certain types of partnerships? And how aggressive can you be in a competitive marketplace like this?
The answer is yes, and I think this is also my point earlier about us being realists in this area. You know, we're in the city that seems to be the hub of the crypto world right now, and I recognize they're enormous consumers of energy, and I think in us partnering with companies, it goes to the point earlier of a coalition, is also being realists in terms of, you know, the 80% roughly of the power, I guess, right now in the world is still carbon-based, is that where can we have an impact and how can we work with others to lead to change? And I think that the crypto community is one of those areas. I think we have to be realists that in terms of how we're going to move this new burgeoning industry along. Mm-hmm. But I think by partnering with organizations like ourselves and others who want to do the right things in this area, and by being part of conversations, that I have no doubt that we can incrementally improve things. But that's why I want to be careful that I'm not sitting here as a purist saying, right. And it's less, honestly, I know that we are a business and there's an economic ramification of everything, but it's not just, and therefore they took the money. Mm-hmm. I mean, honestly, the way, you know, part of us partnering with companies, when we're making those decisions, we look to see what not their carbon footprint is, but what their footprint is in terms of influencers, mm-hmm. and how our fans and players feel connected to those companies. Mm-hmm. And so as the world is moving towards blockchain currencies, and there's social justice issues involved here as well, including those who are underrepresented having a currency to use and who don't have traditional banking accounts. When I think you look at this holistically, that opportunity to partner with these companies, to me, can lead to positive change by bringing them into a larger coalition, and frankly talking openly about these issues and us being open about them as well.
Yeah, engaging and iterating and
yes.
And just being committed to a set of values and figuring it out as you move along. So I think that's a great place to end it. Thank you, Adam, for a terrific conversation.
Thank you, Tom. Thank you,
everybody. Please welcome Daniela Fernandez.
Good morning. Wish I could see your faces a little bit better, but I'll just imagine you here. Well, I'm so happy to be here with you today. Back in February 2014, I was a freshman at Georgetown University, and I attended this meeting at the UN that completely changed my life. You might think that it inspired me into action, but the reality is that it's what led me to start Sustainable Ocean Alliance was not inspiration to action, but rather fear of inaction. After listening to the climate doom and gloom that all the world leaders spoke about, I was left speechless because not one of them spoke about solutions. It was a very disheartening moment for me, being in the room with the brightest minds in the world, the people that had the chance to make change and take action, and yet I was sitting there feeling so helpless. Leaving that UN meeting, I asked myself 3 questions. First, how can we activate an entire generation into becoming sustainability change agents? Second, how do we disrupt, re-engineer, and transform entire industries to protect our planet instead of harming it? And third, and most importantly, what could I do to solve for this climate crisis as a 19-year-old at the time? And so what I did, and the answer to my questions, became taking matters into my own hands and building a global nonprofit that would mobilize my generation into action and also enable the development of the most essential climate and ocean solutions. In 2017, after I graduated from Georgetown, I moved to Silicon Valley, and we built the first ever ocean accelerator program in this space. Since then, it's become a model for other ocean accelerators, which enables us to advance ocean innovation in the blue economy. We have also created the Ocean Leadership Program, which has trained, supported, and funded over 6,000 young leaders in 165 countries. Upon launching these 2 programs, our supporter and funder, Mark Benioff, CEO of Salesforce, challenged us to accelerate 100 ocean solutions, a challenge we accepted because, of course, our planet needed it. So today, 8 years later, after my life-changing experience at the UN, I am so proud and excited to bring you hope, to bring you inspiration, and that blueprint that I wish I had had back in 2014 at the UN. But before revealing the number of solutions we have been able to accelerate, I want to share with you a preview of 22 solutions that I know will inspire you and convince you to be a part of this movement. Are you ready for them? Okay. All right, the first one, cruise foam. They've created an alternative to styrofoam that is made out of biopolymers such as shrimp shells. 2, CalWave. Who's in the room today? Ryan, raise your hand. Wonderful. They convert ocean waves into sustainable and clean energy. 3, Repurpose, a global coalition that allows corporates and individuals to become plastic neutral. 4, Blue Ocean Gear provides real-time gear tracking for commercial fishing fleets out on the ocean to prevent the loss of fishing gear. Plan Blue, they're building a global seafloor database in high detail using underwater satellites to foster a blue economy. 6, Microterra, whom you'll hear from shortly, produces an aquatic plant to provide a nutritional ingredient for the plant-based food industry. 7, Bezos offers sustainability packaging solutions made from seaweed extracts. 8, Coral Vita, winner of the Earthshot Prize. They grow corals up to 50 times faster than in nature, making them more resilient to climate change. 9, Aquai, an AI company that uses a robotic fish, which looks really cool, by the way, to collect data from below the water surface. 10, Verdant Seas creates an algae-based aquaculture feed that results in larger, healthier fish and reduces overfishing in the wild. 11, Novaloop. They transform hard-to-recycle plastics that go into, they transform hard-to-recycle plastic waste into chemical and new materials. 12, Dispatch Goods. They enable people to select reusable packaging when ordering restaurant food to their homes. I'm sure we all needed that during the pandemic. 13, Navier. They're designing the eco-friendly electric boat of the future. Think Tesla for the ocean. And you should get one before they sell out. 14, finless foods. They're creating delicious alternatives to seafood, both plant-based and cell-based, so we can change the way the world eats. 15, My Mizu. They connect people to over 200,000 locations globally where they can refill their water bottles instead of buying a new one. 16, Carbon Ethics. They sequester carbon through the conservation and restoration of coastal habitats like seagrasses and mangroves. 17, Whale Seeker. They protect whales by using AI to ensure faster and more accurate whale strike prevention. 18, Akua, creating kelp-based foods like jerky and burgers that can feed us sustainably while sequestering carbon from our atmosphere. 19, TradeModo. They built a platform for users to easily find, research, and connect with ethical seafood. Think Yelp for ethical seafood. 20, Sine. They're helping maritime-based companies increase efficiency that monitor environmental impact. 21, Ellipsis Earth uses drone footage from around the world to create a plastic waste heat map and helps with collection efforts. And last but not least, we have 22, OceanWorks. They're keeping waste out of the ocean by creating a global marketplace for recycled plastic. So who's inspired after these? Well, that's just a little preview for you of the 22 solutions we have accelerated. And today, for the first time in our history, I'm so proud to unveil SOA's inaugural Ocean Solutions Report, which doesn't only include the 100 solutions we promised the world, but rather it includes the 222 ocean solutions we have accelerated, surpassing our goal and our promise to the world. Thank you. At the end of this presentation, I will be sharing the QR code for you to be the first ones to access the report, which we have officially launched here at the Aspen Ideas Climate Festival. So keep your phones handy to click on that QR code. Now, to close, let me give you the blueprint of what needs to happen for us to develop, invest in, and accelerate in even more climate and ocean solutions. Because the 222 solutions that you just saw are just the beginning. First, we need to pour billions of dollars in the form of investment and philanthropy into the ocean and climate space. We have invested $2 million into for-profit solutions and over $400,000 into nonprofit and grassroots solutions. We're doing our part, but the reality is that the funding gap in the ocean space is actually $149 billion per year. $149 billion per year is what we need to tackle these issues. And so we are looking for investors to co-invest alongside us in these companies, in these solutions, and also looking for philanthropic capital to help us scale our efforts. Second, we need more talent. We need more people to dedicate their lives into building these solutions, into supporting these solutions. You don't need to have a marine degree. You don't need to be a scientist. We're looking for your worldview, your skill set, and your passion. So if that describes you, definitely join us. Third, these solutions require pilots to scale and implementation partners. We're looking for government partners at all levels, corporations and philanthropists, to help us prioritize bringing these solutions you just saw into the market and into scale. So there you have it. That is a very clear direction of what it will take for us to act with urgency, change our economies, and invest in the world we need to see today. So I know that things may seem a little bit grim at the moment, especially after the recent headlines of us being 50% closer to reaching that 1.5 degrees Celsius mark, or the news that emperor penguins, my favorite animal, may be extinct by 2030. Although we are all experiencing climate anxiety, I want to remind you of how lucky we are to be alive right now. We have the power to act, the responsibility to change our ways, and to revolutionize industries in order to save our planet, but frankly, to save ourselves. So the question I'll leave you with is a question I asked myself at 19 years old. What can you do for our climate crisis? We have to be on the right side of history and act, because inaction from our part is equivalent to contributing to damage being done. So join our movement, and here it is, the moment you've all been waiting for, the reveal of our 222 ocean solutions that we hope will inspire many more solutions to come, and also we hope to inspire a movement in the ocean and climate space. Thank you so much. I'm still here. So I'm actually really excited to introduce you to one of the entrepreneurs whose solution you saw, and that is Marissa from, oh, there you are. Welcome to stage.
Very inspiring. Thank you. Hello, everyone. That was inspiring, right? So, one of our greatest challenges of my generation will be how to feed 10 billion people by 2050. Unfortunately, with our current food system, this will not be possible. According to the Ellen MacArthur Foundation, for every dollar we spend in food, we spend $2 more, one in health and the other one in environmental damages. This is shocking, right? But what most people don't know, it's about the interconnection between food and our water systems. We use 70% of the world's fresh water to produce food in agriculture. Unfortunately, agriculture is also the biggest water pollutant. But what is in that wastewater? Well, mainly fertilizer runoff and animal manure. And these both are washed away by rain and irrigation, and they end up in our rivers, our lakes, and eventually the ocean, creating huge environmental challenges. You must have heard about algae blooms, red tides, eutrophication, and dead zones. Yes. So it's about time that we face that what we eat and how we produce it is having a major impact in our environment. And with a growing population and a growing food demand, you can easily imagine that this situation is only going to get worse. But these challenges are also bringing huge opportunities. We have the chance to rethink how to feed 10 billion people in the coming 30 years, to rethink our relationship to nature, to redesign our food system. So the only good thing about that broken food system is that we have the opportunity to rebuild it, and I am sure that we now know better. At Microterra, we believe that by harnessing nature's wisdom, it is possible to clean the water while being profitable, to create a circular economy business where we transform waste into resources and pollution into food. How? We use Lebna, a tiny, fast-growing aquatic plant that duplicates every 36 hours. It's high in protein, and it has texturizing properties. So, in other words, this plant grows by absorbing nitrogen runoff, or agricultural runoff. It grows by cleaning water. So, how do we do it? We partner up with fish farmers to teach them how to grow Lebna. And then, we buy everything that they produce. You see, fish farmers have very risky businesses. High operational cost, low margins, diseases. It's not realistic to expect them to carry the burden of sustainability. We need to change that dynamic. And by putting the right incentives, we are enabling them to be the solution. So, we grow Lebna in existing aqua farms in a scalable, affordable, and sustainable way. In fact, we started with aqua farms, and now we are expanding to hydroponic greenhouses and cattle biodigesters. So we have a decentralized production of Lebna in many farms. Then we bring everything into a centralized facility where we extract taste and color, and we transform Lebna into a high-value ingredient for the plant-based food industry. I'm sure you all have heard how the plant-based food is being revolutionizing. They bring nutritional food and delicious food out to the market in a sustainable way. But what all these companies have in common is a huge challenge to replicate the experience of the animal products. They need to replicate taste and texture. Taste is something that we as a society have somehow some experience. But texture is a new challenge. And at Microterra, we develop texturizers for the plant-based food industry. And so that's how we transform the biggest water pollutant into some pretty delicious food. This is how you transform a problem into a great business opportunity, thinking about our farmers, our planet, while still making revenue. So, at Microterra, we clean the polluted wastewater on site. We eliminate the downstream pollution, and we transform waste into a resource. This is how our food system should look like. This is the opportunity that I'm talking about. So, if you get nothing from this talk but one thing, let it be that the only good thing about having a broken food system is that we have a chance to rebuild it, and we now know better. Thank you so much.
And now, Owen Oliver with Nikki Pitre from the Aspen Institute Center for Native American Youth.
Klushi-san. Chief Seattle once said, "Will you teach your children what we have taught our children? That the earth is our mother. What befalls on the earth befalls on all the sons of the earth. This we know. The earth does not belong to the man belongs to the earth. All things are connected like the blood that unites us all."
From the moment my daughter's feet touched the earth, her father and I knew we had a responsibility to ensure that she knew her role as a steward of the land and water. Today, when she approaches the water, she says, "Lim lenchsikwe," thank you, water. When she sees mountains, she greets them as she knows that they are her grandfathers. At 5 years old, she understands that we are all connected like the blood that unites us all. However, that connection is at risk because our earth is changing. As a mother, as a future ancestor, I worry that the stories that were passed on to us will be forced to change in my daughter's generation because of climate change. As Native people, our relationship with the land is integral to our social, cultural, and spiritual identity. It is part of our livelihood, and unfortunately, that livelihood is being negatively impacted by climate change. We have seen how climate change is altering our relationship between our animal and land relatives. It is also altering our relationships we have within our own communities and our people. You see, these relationships are central to our physical, mental, and spiritual well-being. Climate change impacts our ability to share traditional knowledge about our natural environment, food systems, ceremony, and more. In short, climate change will result in the loss to knowledge, increase food insecurity, and exacerbate health disparities that already exist within our tribal communities. My people, the Stjitsu'umsh, have called the Pacific Northwest home since time immemorial, and we are so rich. We have bountiful salmon, traditional medicines, berries, roots, elk, buffalo, eagles. We are rich in balance and in harmony, and we are surrounded by a powerful healing medicine, the kwai, salk, the cedar trees. And to the west, we have the Salish Sea, our sacred salmon relatives, countless tribal nations. In this place, I learned the importance of healing our mother and healing our community. When a kwai salk is sick or damaged, the surrounding cedar trees will wrap its roots around the damaged one. The healthy kwai salk will move its nutrients out of itself, depleting itself, until the damaged kwai salk is well enough to support itself again. It is then that the healthy trees will unwrap their roots and untangle the roots, and all will stand strong together. It is in this lesson that we learn the responsibility of healing our people, our relatives, and our earth. I imagine all of us as Kwai Salk, as it will take all of us to come together, wrap our roots around our mother, and heal. I invite you to reflect on a time that you have been supported or received support from someone or something in order to heal. Stamelguinis, my relatives, when we talk about climate solutions, we are talking about healing. Healing culture, healing community, healing ourselves, healing our world. A cultural teaching that we have is in order for healing and transformation, we must have a space down to lay down our truth. And here is ours. Too often, the conversation and investment in climate solutions leaves out indigenous voices, the voices that have been the Earth's strongest advocates since time immemorial. Here's why indigenous voices matter. Indigenous people are the original stewards of this land and keepers of traditional ecological knowledge. And although we comprise of less than 5% of the world's population, we protect 80% of the Earth's biodiversity in forests, deserts, grasslands, and marine environments. In the United States alone, tribal trust land provides homes for
more than 525 endangered species,
more than 13,000 rivers,
and nearly 100,000 lakes.
Finally, many indigenous communities are on the front lines of climate change, facing this harsh reality, a reality that many non-tribal communities will soon face unless we act fast. As we all face this hard truth of climate change, indigenous voices are finally being elevated. The Secretary of Interior, the person responsible for protecting our natural resources and carrying out the trust responsibilities to indigenous people and nations, is a citizen of the Pueblo of Laguna. Secretary Holland states, certainly, in this time of climate change bearing down upon us, indigenous knowledge about our natural world will be extremely valuable and important to us all. Indian tribes have been on this continent for millennia. They know how to care for the land. That knowledge has been passed down from generations and generations. We've also seen this administration commit to elevating indigenous traditional ecological knowledge in federal scientific and policy processes and drastically increase funding for the Tribal Climate Resilience Program. I'm further encouraged by strong voices of Native youth, and I'm so honored to share this stage with my young relative and one of the Earth's strongest advocates, Owen Oliver. Today, Owen and I are going to talk about how to center indigenous solutions as a means of wrapping our roots together to heal. It is our hope that after this talk, you will feel a sense of responsibility to reckon with our truth and commit to healing through indigenous methodologies.
I come from the people of the lower Columbia River, the Salish Sea, and the southwest pueblos of Isleta. This is a sentence that states my ancestry through hundreds of generations that have learned from the land from each other, and each developed their own ways to display knowledge systems through art and traditions. However, to the federal government, I am an enrolled Quinault tribal member whose lands are on the west coast of Washington. This morning, as I greeted the Atlantic Ocean, I think of the response that the Pacific Ocean will say when I greet it back later this summer. What will I take back? What will I learn here? And how will my knowledge systems differ? When I reflect back on what's guided me here today, I envision a 36-foot-long canoe traversing the Columbia River and exiting the opening of the Pacific Ocean. I envision gripping my cedar paddle and imprinting the grooves of wood that has already been calloused over on previous journeys. I envision myself greeting the host tribe and stating my intentions and relationships that have been built over and over in the same way I'm introducing myself here. I envision a future where my descendants can envision those same things that we face today. The canoe culture in the Pacific Northwest has been revitalized through the elders that barely grew up with them. Before canoes were launched in 1989 at the Paddle of Seattle, those knowledge systems were locked away for over 60 years. They endured boarding schools, assimilation, and relocation. Yet my whole life, I've had the privilege to grow up around them and be the new generation that didn't have a gap with traditional canoes. Something that I have to reconcile with that my ancestors did not is the rapid effects of climate change on my people and relatives. In Quinault territory, we're wrestling with the continuous increasing rise in sea level and the looming threats of tsunamis. The Quinault Tribal Council has been planning and creating a task force to relocate the village upland to save our most vulnerable population, our elders. Through the $60 million project, we will again have to move away from our traditional beaches, tide flats, and shorelines that have been connected with us through the canoe. Climate change doesn't stop here, though. Our lakes and rivers that have provided home grounds for salmon are threatened. The Anderson Glacier that feeds the Quinault River from the Olympic Mountains has retreated to the size of a few ice cubes. This means less water is being replenished to feed and cool the river. There was a story in 2005 that said the Quinault River was so incredibly low that a tribal member could walk across the newly exposed river. A tribal member did begin to walk across that river, and he stubbed his toe on a mastodon jaw that was submerged 12,000 years ago during the last ice age. We are beginning to unearth the harsh realities that climate change poses to all of us, how food systems are being exhausted and our shorelines eroding, and our landscapes that held stories for us are changing with the extreme weather. I see the change in the landscape each time I enter back into the canoe as we paddle across similar lands. The mountains look shaved from clear cutting, shorelines have become closer and closer to the tree lines, and our stories begin to change. Those key images that our ancestors told us orally begin to unfold like a giant game of telephone, where once they talked about a mountain that fed their village with water is now just a snowless mound. Soon that story will be lost because our stories required us to witness the land and listen from it. There's no winner in the game of telephone, just a loser who says, "Why didn't anyone listen to me?" I want you to listen. I want you to remember this. I want you to know that I plan on building a future where my descendants can acknowledge our difficult history with climate change, but can continue to move forward and keep climate change at bay because we provided them the tools they need.
The shining water that moves in streams and rivers is not just water, but the blood of our ancestors. If we sell you this land, we must remember that it is sacred, and that each ghostly reflection on the clear water of the lakes tells of events and memories in the life of my people. The water's murmur is a voice of our grandfathers, Chief Seattle. I grew up seeing pictures of my Tsutsuten, my ancestors, and the way that they used to hunt and provide for the community. There's a picture of warriors out on our lake, our Chak'ele, in a sturgeon canoe. They're drawing back a bow and arrow on our waterways, and they're hunting elk who are grazing on the land. Nearly 25 years ago, my tribe, the Coeur d'Alene, was in a fight to reclaim our land and our lake, to heal our Sikwe, our Chak'ele, because of the impacts of climate change and man-made disruption of Lake Coeur d'Alene, which caused toxins such as uranium, silver, and other contaminants, and nearly depleted our traditional plants and wildlife. It was forgotten that our Sikwe was sacred. Our Sikwe was sick, and we had a collective responsibility as the first stewards of this land to wrap our roots around it and heal it. In the case Idaho versus the Coeur d'Alene tribe in 1997, my tribe won back 2/3 of Lake Coeur d'Alene. And through tribally chartered natural resources, we are restoring wildlife, reintroducing trout and other fish back into the lake. We are bringing back traditional plants in hopes that the wildlife will have their food and balance will be restored. And though my tribe only owns 2/3 of the lake through the United States Supreme Court ruling, we are responsible for 100% of the healing and restoration and reversing the impacts of climate change. We do this because we have a collective responsibility, a relationship that we have to our sacred places. As Chief Seattle said, we recognize the Sique is the blood of our ancestors. I know it is possible in my lifetime to see my daughter and her generation hunt and be on the water like that picture of our Tsutsuten. Our youth deserve to hear the voices of our grandpas in sacred waterways.
Nikki and I both graduated from the University of Washington with degrees in American Indian Studies. We are here today because of the strengths that we were able to lean into Indigenous communities on and off campus. The American Indian Studies Department felt like a safe home always to call back to. It brought us healing when we needed it the most and always pushed us to innovate our community's ways of thinking. When I graduated from the University of Washington, I wanted to reflect on my time as a Coast Salish person. I wanted to catalog and promote Indigenous arts across campus. While researching indigeneity on campus, I discovered a Yakima story depicted on a mural that's resonated with me since. The Ayayesh girl is sitting next to grandmother cedar tree after being sent away from her tribe for not knowing anything. She sits and listens to the task that cedar asks of her. Slowly but surely, grandmother cedar tree teaches her how to weave a basket and recognize the designs in the world to incorporate them into her basket. The symbols of rattlesnakes slither across the top and mountains are reflected in the base. With a proud grasp of the basket, she dunks it into a nearby stream to test if her work will hold water. Unsuccessful with her first rendition, her third and final basket achieves the skill of holding water. The girl goes back to her village to show off what she's accomplished. At first, her community doesn't believe her, but as the girl tells her own story, shows off the watertight basket and the complexity of the design, the doubt, shame, and name Ayayesh are taken off of the girl. She isn't shunned as a less intelligent child, but welcomed as a source of knowledge. Her dreams of not being the Ayayesh girl is realized in the land, and she's transformed through telling her own story. The story of the Ayayesh girl is about learning and witnessing from the land. We can see the land as a relationship and a teacher rather than a resource we have to extract from. When I tell this story, I'm often reminded of a rule I learned as a kid in the canoe. The rule states, "The gift of each enriches us all." It explains that everyone has something to learn from each other and everyone has a gift to share. Yet we need to understand, in order to listen to people, you need to be a responsible witness that actively listens and engages. By believing Indigenous people's stories and their experiences, you are giving justice to their knowledge systems that have been curated since time immemorial. It's going to be these knowledge systems that help accelerate our fight on climate change, because without them, we are just a canoe with no paddles.
When discussing Indigenous solutions, we need to start looking at a big picture, a holistic vision, because everything is interconnected. Do not get lost in singular issues. Man did not weave the web of life, he is merely one strand in it. Whatever he does to the web, he does to himself. Chief Seattle.
We must stop looking at our land, water, and air as extractive and view it as our relatives, our grandfathers, our brothers. When we start thinking about climate as a relative, we'll inherently care for it and treat it differently. Only when the last tree has died and the last river has been poisoned and the last fish has been caught, we will realize we cannot eat money. Chief Seattle.
When we all recognize our role in settler colonialism, we can start to decolonize the way that we are in relationship with Mother Earth. We will gain a new respect and balance of healing our relatives before we lose it all in climate change. Everything on earth has purpose, every disease an herb to cure it, and every person a mission. This is the Indian theory of existence. Morning dove.
There is truth in culture. Uplift and validate indigenous ways of knowing. There is true science in the past, the present, and the future. Traditional teachings show us that we must shift from a reactive approach to climate work to be proactive. It's learning alongside climate leadership and coming as a collective to heal.
Currently, indigenous-led organizations receive 0.4% of the philanthropic dollar. Invest in us, invest in our voices, invest in our solutions, invest in our healing. When the blood in your veins returns to the sea and the earth in your bones returns to the ground, perhaps you will remember that this land does not belong to you. It is you who belongs to the land.
Hello, everyone. Thanks so much for joining us here this week. I'm Greg Gershuni. I'm the director of the Aspen Energy and Environment Program, and I'm the co-director of Aspen Ideas Climate. We work to move people, organizations, and governments towards taking greater action on solving the climate crisis.
And I'm Mai Sisla, Deputy Director of the Aspen Tech Policy Hub. We are a sister program at the Aspen Institute dedicated to training science and technology experts on how to impact public policy. Our teams have been working together to tackle one of the most critical issues in the climate policy and tech spaces today, improving diversity, equity, and inclusion. As most of you know, the climate policy and tech spaces suffer from a stark lack of racial, ethnic, and gender diversity. 60% of climate policy workers identify as white, while less than 30% of workers in the clean energy sector identify as women. To help make these spaces more inclusive for all, our teams are excited to tell you about 2 joint initiatives.
First, we're announcing the inaugural class of the Aspen Climate Cohort. The cohort aims to diversify the tech climate space by training STEM experts who already understand climate and how to better apply their ideas in the policy area. Our inaugural fellows include founders who have started renewable energy companies, academics who've worked on global water policy, and engineers working in federal and state government. We also are pleased to say that 75% of the cohort identify as female, and more than 50% identify as people of color. These fellows will work with us for 10 weeks, full-time, starting in June, to learn more about how they can impact policy. You can learn more about these fellows in the upcoming weeks by following EEP and the Tech Policy Hub on social media or joining our mailing lists.
In addition, our teams, in consultation with the environmental watchdog organization Green 2.0, are thrilled to release today our new report on improving diversity, equity, and inclusion in the climate policy and tech spaces. This report provides concrete best practices on how individual companies, nonprofit organizations, or government agencies within the United States can improve DEI within their own workplaces. It includes recommendations on how organizations can ensure leadership are held to accountable DEI goals, mechanisms to make sure hiring practices are more equitable, and what organizations can do to welcome more young, underrepresented people into the climate workforce. The recommendations discussed here were developed in a roundtable with an intergenerational group of climate policy and tech leaders from across multiple sectors. We hope this report will be a good starting point as organizations try to make their workplaces more inclusive. You can read this report at aspentechpolicyhub.org/DEI in climate.
We hope both the climate cohort and the DEI and climate policy and tech report are able to help move the needle towards a more inclusive and equitable solutions for all. Thank you.
And now, please welcome Jason Bordoff, Meghan O'Sullivan, and Indira Lakshmanan with National Geographic.
Hello, everybody. Good morning. We're so happy to have you here with us. I am incredibly pleased to be able to have this conversation with Meghan O'Sullivan and Jason Bordoff. Meghan, for those of you who don't know, is a professor at Harvard's Kennedy School of Government and former Deputy National Security Advisor to President George W. Bush. Jason is the co-dean of Columbia's School of Climate and also former energy advisor to President Obama at the National Security Council. So we're going to turn our focus today on really the connection between climate and national security. And it's not just President Biden who said last year that climate is the greatest single threat facing the United States. It's not just the chairman of the Joint Chiefs who said that climate is an existential threat to the world, the defense secretary who called it one of the greatest threats to our existence. So it's something that I feel like in a lot of domestic climate conversations, we don't focus enough on the global, not only for us as Americans, national security, but the worldwide security concerns that are raised by all this. Everything from food security, poverty, flooding, forced migration. I want to start, Jason, by asking you about the current crisis in the headlines, which is, of course, Russia's invasion of Ukraine. And that has had a real effect on energy in Europe, since, as we know, the EU is extremely dependent on Russia for oil and natural gas. So in a way, is this invasion with the EU trying to do a ban, an embargo on Russian oil, which we know because of Hungary is not going through at this point, is this going to accelerate an energy transition in Europe because of this war, which would of course be exactly against Russia's interests?
Thanks, Indira. It's great to be with you, and thanks to Aspen Institute for this extraordinary event and for having me and Meghan here. I think the answer to your question has to be yes. I'm actually optimistic it will be yes. And I think coming back to the way you introed it, what's happening in the world now is a reminder of something Meghan and I have been thinking and writing about, which is there needs to be more, but there has been focus and discussion on the national security threats of climate change, worse heat waves, droughts, migration, refugee flows, all of which is correct and deeply concerning. We've been thinking about if there is a clean energy transition, which hopefully there will be, more than there is now, to what extent that can also have its own geopolitical risks. And I think we think those haven't gotten enough attention. The transition is a multi-decade process. It doesn't happen overnight. If you see a transition start to unfold and we invest less in oil and gas with some of the large majors we've all heard of, the world's still as it is today, right? What happens when Russia's taken off the board? You look for whatever supply you can find around the world to help keep gasoline prices affordable for people. There's not many sources to go to. You go to Venezuela, you go to Iran, you go to Saudi Arabia, you go to UAE, you could see feast before famine for some of the petrostates around the world. We are leading another roundtable process now, a task force for the Aspen Institute on the threats of supply chains for critical minerals, which mostly are refined and processed in China. So a range of potential concerns like that. And I think those are being highlighted by the conflict in Russia and Ukraine right now. We're seeing an energy crisis unfold today that I worry we have not seen the worst of it yet. Europe is going to have an incredibly difficult time making it through next winter, particularly if it's cold. You have very high oil and gasoline prices for people. And so the near-term response to that, every time there's an oil crisis throughout history, again and again, politicians look for what they can do immediately to help provide relief. And you look for extra supply you can find, and you ramp up production wherever you can. You subsidize fuel prices, you roll back fuel taxes. The opposite of what you would do if you actually wanted to facilitate a transition away from hydrocarbons. There was a moment in the early 2000s when conservative national security hawks came together with progressive NGOs, environmental groups, and worked together to push Congress to reduce oil use, because we were importing 2/3 of our oil at the time, and it was a national security threat as well as an environmental risk. We have to use this as a moment to remember that and come together again and say it doesn't matter that the US was a net exporter of oil last year, as opposed to importing 2/3 of our oil. We're just as exposed at the pump when something happens in Russia. This has to be a reminder that we would be more energy secure as well as climate secure if we were using less oil and gas in the first place. And you see a lot of European governments have committed to do that, dramatically expand renewables and heat pumps and all the rest. It just takes time. It doesn't happen quickly. It doesn't help with the immediate crisis of the moment. Some of it can, like efficiency, turning down your thermostat a few degrees. But once this crisis eases, and hopefully it will, we need to stay the course and learn the lesson of this crisis, which is to reduce how much hydrocarbons we consume in the first place, both for climate, but also we're being reminded for national security reasons.
I mean, you talk about that, but I feel like it's an addiction that we seem to be unable to wean ourselves off of. And I think, Meghan, about how the last time Russia invaded Ukraine and annexed Crimea in 2014, at the time, I was covering the State Department and national security, and many people said, this is the moment for Europe to get off of its dependence of Russian gas. This is the moment to do an oil embargo. Those things never happened back then in 2014. 8 years later, we're talking about the same thing all over again. And I wonder, is it because it can't be done? Can Europe do without Russian energy? I mean, we see Hungary putting a wrench in the spokes there by saying, no, we're too dependent on Russian oil, and being the one holdout from an embargo.
Great, thanks, Indira. And I do think it's a reasonable question to say, haven't we been down this road before? And actually, before the annexation of Crimea in 2006 and 2009, there were other hiccups where Russian gas did not flow freely through Ukraine and created, smaller energy crises in Europe, and the same kind of impetus was there. I would say two things. The first thing I would say is that this is a very different magnitude of the crisis. I think it's fair to say, and we may have Europeans here in this audience, that this has profoundly shaken Europeans. This is, we're talking about atrocities of an unimaginable scale, just, that this would be happening in 2022 in the heart of Europe. So I think the perception of Russia as a reliable supplier, as a partner that Europe could work with, has fundamentally altered. I could be wrong about that, but I look at the change in posture that the German government has taken, not just on energy matters, but also on national security matters, on political matters, on diplomatic matters, and I really feel like this is fundamental. So I think we're in a fundamentally different geopolitical landscape. The second point I would make is I don't think it's impossible. I think, as Jason said, it just takes a little bit more time than many people would like. I think the imperative is obvious to everyone now. I mean, there's the geopolitical threat of imminent cutoff, but there's also the very, beyond uncomfortable reality that Europe is sending $800 million a day for some of its energy sales to Russia, at the same time that Russia is persecuting this war. So it's morally unsustainable for the Europeans as well. We're seeing that oil is going to be easier to replace, and that's not surprising because of the global nature of the oil market. There will be potential hiccups there, but that's easier to do. And I expect that they will be able to manage this Hungarian objection one way or the other. The natural gas is going to take longer, but I do believe Europe is on track. I think there's a larger question, I'll stop there depending on what direction you'd like to go, about not how does it change the European conversation about the pace and nature of the energy transition, while at the same time they're focused on energy security, but also what it means for the rest of the world. Because as you noted, this is a crisis that has global implications, both for energy security, for human security, and for climate security.
I do want to get there to the whole world. Jason, first, I guess I want to ask you briefly if you can tell us we can be prescriptive. This is the Aspen Ideas, Climate Festival. We can be prescriptive. What should European and US policymakers be doing now to try to address both the energy crisis and the climate crisis simultaneously? Or is it even possible to address energy security and climate security at the same time?
It absolutely is. There, is some tension where you need to make sure. We believe, I think, I won't speak for Meghan, but we've done a lot of writing together. It is harder, not easier, to maintain support for strong climate action if you're in the middle of an energy crisis and people worry about whether they can pay their heating bills and pay their gasoline bills. So I think it is helpful not only economically and geopolitically, but also for climate action to deal with the immediate crisis and make sure you can stabilize energy prices and you don't have prices going through the roof or difficulty meeting heating needs next winter in Europe. you want to do as much as you can with efficiency, as much as you can with alternatives, but when you're trying to take the largest oil and gas producer in the world off the table to apply maximum pressure to Putin, you're going to have to find some other oil and gas supplies elsewhere and do that in a way that minimizes the extent to which you're locking in long-term investments that make it harder to transition. So we have to address the immediate crisis. Hydrocarbons are part of that, just to keep energy prices stable and affordable for people. You look at the Yellow Vest protests or anything else, if people have trouble paying their energy bills, we worry it's going to undermine support for the strong climate action we need. And the most important thing is to then, not like we always do, have short memories about this, and as soon as the immediate crisis passes, become complacent, but stay the course for the things that would make you more secure the next time there is a crisis, because inevitably there'll be one. And we say that every time, but if we had done that with renewable energy and heat pumps and electric vehicles and more fuel-efficient cars, Europe would be more resilient today to the possible disruptions that it's facing in hydrocarbon outages.
So Meghan, take us back to the global view and the ripple effect that this has. What is the clean energy transition going to mean for energy geopolitics? And specifically, I'm interested in your view on, is this crisis in Russia and Ukraine, is it a one-off? Or is it a harbinger of things to come, that we're going to have crises that are either going to accelerate our energy transition or somehow make it harder?
Sure. And I think building on what Jason said, the important thing is for the world to not consider this to be a one-off. This is the last hiccup of a petrostate or something along those lines. Because if we look at the geopolitical landscape and how it interacts with the energy transition, we see the longer the transition takes, the longer it is that governments are able to put the policies in place, then the private sector is able to come in. The longer that takes, the more opportunity there are for geopolitical actors to come in and exercise undue influence with traditional fossil fuel usage. Because even before this crisis in Russia, there was a mismatch going on. The world had become really focused on the fact that perhaps we needed to bring down the investment in oil and gas production in order to meet our climate goals, but at the same time, there wasn't the same focus on bringing down demand for these fossil fuels. So we were having a growing gap between very robust demand for fossil fuels and less investment in fossil fuel production. And it's that gap that created a lot of geopolitical power for Russia and could do so again for other suppliers, be it states in the Gulf or other producers, or potentially in other forms of energy inputs. So we have to be cognizant, going back to the point that Jason began with, we have to be cognizant that getting a successful clean energy transition is not just about the technologies, the policy, the price on carbon. It's also about managing the geopolitics. And that's one of our big points that we've been writing about so much, is that, and in some ways the Russian crisis really creates a focus on this, that if we don't anticipate the geopolitics better and manage them better, which includes expediting the energy transition so these actors have less power over a longer period of time, we worry that those geopolitics will be the biggest threat to the energy transition overall.
Right. Well, I mean, I would say that one of the threats to the energy transition, Jason, if we look at it in the short term, is the energy price outlook. And talk to us about the price that we're seeing at the pump now. It doesn't seem like it's politically sustainable across the partisan lines. We have politicians who have a knee-jerk reaction to higher oil prices or higher gas prices at the pump. So tell us about what is that going to mean for stronger climate action? And I'd also like you to lay out for us the sort of ripple effect that you and Meghan have written about. Oil and gas, but it also leads to coal prices in India, and tell us about that.
Yeah, I mean, the energy system is global and it's interconnected. So you face the disruption of Russia, which supplies 40% of Europe's gas, most of it by pipeline. If that is lost, Europe has to get its natural gas from somewhere else, as well as efficiency and reducing demand and putting renewables in place. But they have a goal of reducing the dependence on Russian gas 2/3 by the end of the year. You can't do all of that with alternatives alone. You're going to need to pull some other supplies of natural gas into Europe. Most of that will be liquefied natural gas coming from the global market. Those are supplies. There's not a lot of extra liquefied natural gas out there, so those are supplies that will come from somewhere else. They're going to come probably from Asia. That means Asia is using something else. China has announced it's increasing its coal production 300 million tons this year. Coal prices are at record levels as well. which is having a ripple effect in emerging markets and lower income countries like Pakistan and others, which are having trouble affording the cheap energy sources they need to keep the electricity on, in the midst of, over the course of the summer, these horrific heat waves that are getting worse and worse because of climate change. We saw India over the last week or so with a combination of heat, temperature, and humidity that was coming dangerously close to the first chapter of Ministry for the Future. Like, it's not fiction. This is actually happening at some point very soon. And keeping the air conditioning on to cool people and save lives, that they rely on cheap energy, and a lot of that comes from coal. This, in turn, is having an impact on food prices, and we're gearing up for a potentially severe food crisis globally. Oil is another factor. We're trying to take Russian oil off the market. Oil's over $100 a barrel. The national average in the US, $4.40, which is, not that expensive compared to Europe, but politically not comfortable here. So again, what are politicians doing in response? They're finding every tool they can to try to provide some relief. The largest release of oil from the Strategic Petroleum Reserve in history. Across Europe, they're rolling back fuel taxes, subsidizing energy prices for people. That's the near-term pressure. We need to make sure that we're supplying people with affordable energy today so people don't have a sense of crisis with their ability to access energy today in order to maintain support for stronger climate action, as I said before. But, this energy crisis is not over. It's going to get worse before it gets better, I fear. And we may be looking at, the worst energy crisis since the 1970s.
You reference Ministry of the Future, this dystopian novel about climate change and all of the horrific knock-on effects it can have, but I feel that we haven't talked enough about the risks of decarbonization in itself, because there are also, the energy transition is bringing its own geopolitical risks. It's absolutely necessary, it has to happen, but we also have to prepare for those geopolitical risks. So Meghan, I'd like you to talk about how there might be changing behavior by petrostates who might be trying to thwart our energy transition, or, in general, how is this going to play out? It's not a sort of like we go this one path and we have no risks. Either path we take, there are going to be geopolitical security risks.
Yeah, exactly. I think one of the things that has motivated Jason and I to do the flurry of writing that we've been doing recently is that when we look at the geopolitics of a world of net zero, 2050, we're willing to say, on the whole, we think those look better. Those look easier to manage. But that distance to get there from here to 2050 or to net zero is going to be filled with geopolitical upsets and geopolitical turmoil. And certainly the petrostate question is one that I think has not yet been sufficiently understood and examined. On the whole, the conventional wisdom is this energy transition is going to be terrible for petrostates, and it's going to result in a lot of political instability. And I think in some cases that will certainly be true, but the answer to that question is a little bit more nuanced in the sense that, not all petrostates are the same. Some have weak institutions and very heavy reliance on fossil fuel exports and very little ability to kind of diversify their economy and manage the transition. And those are the ones that we should be most worried about. And that's a significant number of large producers, particularly in places like Africa and Latin America. On the other hand, you look at the Gulf states, and there the situation is a little bit different because, one, they do have stronger institutions, and they do have a greater ability to try to diversify their economy, although we're seeing that continues to be quite hard. But most importantly, we all now know, having looked at the net zero scenarios more closely, that every single net zero scenario still has a significant amount of oil that's consumed by the globe. And countries like Saudi Arabia and the Emirates, they have a lot of reasonably placed confidence that they are going to be the last producer standing. They are going to be supplying the world with whatever oil the world is still consuming because they're the lowest cost producers and they have relatively or comparatively low greenhouse gas emissions. And if that's the case, then we have another geopolitical issue to think about. How comfortable is the world consuming less oil, but having virtually all of the oil that the world is consuming coming from a couple of states in the Gulf? And I think particularly in light of what's happening in Russia, there's probably less comfort with that scenario, but that's where we will be heading unless we think about alternative policy interventions.
Very quickly, Jason, tell me, Russia, as well as other states, are not just major producers of oil and gas, but also of commodities. So when we go through this energy transition, are we simply replacing one kind of risk with oil and gas for another, which is critical minerals that we need for that fossil fuel-free future?
Yeah, well, again, we're leading a task force for the Aspen Institute now, so we'll tell you more about this when that process is done early next year, but obviously there's a lot of work has gone into that. And I think there is a risk of that. We need a lot of critical minerals like lithium and cobalt and nickel and others. There's much more concentration of those. So the largest oil producers in the world, the United States, Saudi Arabia, and Russia, each produce around 10% of world supply. For each of those other minerals I just mentioned, rare earth elements, cobalt, lithium, the largest producer for each produces more than 50% of supply. So that's a lot of concentration in one country. And most of that is refined and processed, not necessarily mined and produced, but refined and processed in China, the vast majority of the world's critical minerals. And refining and processing is a messy business, and it is not environmentally friendly, and it takes time to build up those supply chains. So I think one of the lessons we're learning from what's happening in Europe in the Russia-Ukraine crisis is where energy security comes from. It's not necessarily that you don't want to get it from this country or this country, but diversification of supply. So part of the problem in Europe was not that only that it bought gas from Russia, but it bought so much gas from Russia. If you lost 10 or 15% of your supply, you could probably make it up elsewhere. When it's 40%, you don't have that kind of option. So you want to diversify your sources of supply. And then have optionality. When something goes wrong, you can go into a more integrated market where there's different producers you can pull from. Prices will go up, but you can pull from them. I think that's a role for policy. I mean, the private sector alone doesn't have an economic incentive to spend extra money for diversification or optionality or some redundant infrastructure. So if something goes wrong here, you can produce it here. That is a role for government because there's broader social costs to energy security problems. And so I do think government policymakers need to think more about not necessarily onshoring everything. It's not that everything has to be made within your own borders, although there are some benefits to that as well, but making sure that you're working with partners to have a more diverse supply chain, and we're developing these materials not only in just a handful of places.
So can I just come in
and
on
there's
that?
There's no lack of supply, too. I should say there's plenty of these critical minerals in different places.
Yeah, no, and I think those are all really important points. I just wanted to add another element of that, another potential risk to the energy transition is the reliance on those critical minerals. We need not only to diversify the supply chain, but also to massively increased production. If we look at the International Energy Agency's kind of landmark report on these critical minerals from a year ago, it talked about how in a net zero world, we will need 6 times more of those critical minerals than is produced today. And if we look at individual things like lithium, which is key for batteries and electric vehicles, that will need 42 times what the world is producing today by 2040 or 2050. I mean, those are massive increases. And so I think there are 2 real serious potential constraints there that requires, as Jason said, some real policymaker attention.
And just, can I say one thing very quickly? Because it goes beyond mining. Like, it's a really important point that if we want to have a clean energy transition, which we have to have, every week has to be infrastructure week. We have to build so much stuff. Steel in the ground, transmission wires for renewable energy, offshore wind, a lot of mining. There are environmental issues with doing that for local wildlife and for rivers and lakes. And I mean, we have to sort of grapple harder than we are with the trade-offs. You want to minimize them, but it's not that there is zero, because we got to build a lot of stuff to have a clean energy transition.
Well, if I can plug, we literally just had a story on nationalgeographic.com last week, which was specifically on this question of the energy transition and sort of risks to wildlife with all this new building that we're doing versus the risks to wildlife from not having a clean energy transition. So it's sort of those 2 things come in conflict. With just the short time we have left, I have a quick question for you before the lightning round finish, which is I want to ask you, Meghan, do you see the energy transition as being an equalizing force for globalization, or do you see it as exacerbating existing inequalities between rich and poor countries?
Sure. I think this is the kind of question that the answer is unknown, that if the energy transition continues as it is right now, I would say that my guess is this will be this will exacerbate inequality. And part of the reason has to do with just what we're seeing today about the need for the developing world to grapple with so many things simultaneously. I'm pretty confident that the developed world is in a position to manage energy security and the transition. It has a political consensus, at least in Europe, and it has resources and policy-making institutions. In big parts of the developing world, there's an additional, even more overriding challenge, and that is addressing energy access, the 800 million people who have no access to electricity. So we're at a stage where we're asking the developing world to address energy access for prosperity and physical well-being, to do this in a decarbonizing way, and all of this in the context of a potentially worsening energy crisis and a food crisis. So this is a lot we are heaping on the developing world. And my concern is that unless the developed world really puts more of its attention on how it is going to help the developing world, we're going to have more of a bifurcation. We're going to kind of have a more clean energy developed world, and we'll have a coal-using developing world that is suffering many of the consequences of climate change and in an even more acute manner than we're feeling here in the United States and in Europe.
All right, so the two of you have been telling cold, hard truths to our audience here. Let's, in this lightning round finish, give them some sense of hope. What is the way that we're going to do this where we get the decarbonized energy transition future, but we do it without destroying the world order, disrupting, having the kind of crisis that is written about in these dystopian novels that we just talked about? You go first, Jason.
There are a lot of reasons for hope and optimism, including the fact that so many people came together to talk about this here in Miami, the technological progress we're seeing, the cost declines, like the goal of net zero electricity by 2035 in the US would have seemed very, very hard and unaffordable 15 years ago. It's totally doable now. We have a lot of stuff we can put to work and just let's get going, and then let's figure out how to bring down the cost of the harder stuff and make it more affordable for the developing world. I'll just say the thing that gives me the most hope, I'm leaving the conference a little bit early tomorrow morning in order to get back to New York on Friday for the first ever graduation of the Columbia Climate School. And you can't work with, thank you. It's a really exciting day, not just because we've built something at Columbia that we think is innovative and really exciting, but the students are extraordinary, and you can't work with young people, whether it's undergraduates or master's or PhD students. The brilliance, the passion, I mean, they are deeply committed to dealing with this problem better than we did, and they're just extraordinary. And so I'm inspired every day by them, and I know they're going to change the world.
Well, Meghan, you also have students at the Kennedy School, but beyond all of your students being our hope for the future, give us some other bit of hope to hang on to. How do you see this playing out in your best case scenario when you dream at night of how this is going to play out in a positive way? What's that dream?
Okay, let me answer that just slightly more generally, but I do think there is hope and place for optimism here, in addition to our remarkable students, who I have to give mine a plug for as well. But I would say that, when you think of what the world has been facing in the last couple of years only, the intensifying climate crisis, COVID, now this war in Europe, I believe that these challenges are so dramatic that they have shaken up a lot of the conversations, a lot of the policy conversations, and a lot of the ideology that had existed about what was possible, what was not possible, what the role of government is, what it shouldn't be. All of that is kind of up for grabs, and we have an opportunity to reshape the landscape for action in a different way because we see the enormity of the problems. And Jason mentioned the potential for a coalition in America that didn't exist even 6 months ago, I think is there for the taking, where we have the possibility of thinking, envisioning, and executing an integrated climate and energy policy strategy that we haven't had before because people have been entrenched. So I would say, and people looking at COVID, we've really all accepted a larger role for government in our lives.
Just from a Republican.
From a Republican, exactly. So, and I think that creates enormous opportunities for tackling the many challenges before us.
Well, thank you so much. Please join me in thanking Meghan O'Sullivan and Jason Bordoff for giving us some hope.
Thank you, Indira.
Thanks.
That concludes this morning's session. The next set of sessions begins at 11:30.